This is Join Us in France, episode 381. 381. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France. Everyday life in France, great places to visit in France, French culture, history, gastronomy, and news related to travel to France. Today, I bring you a conversation with Elyse Rivin of Toulouse Guided Walks about the Saint Denis Cathedral in the Paris region. So I guess today it's going to be Tales from the Crypt. Or perhaps we'll tell you about a beautiful place where French kings and queens were laid to rest. This podcast is supported by donors and listeners who buy my tours and services, including my very popular Itinerary Planning Service. You can browse all of that at Annie's Boutique, joinusinfrance.com/boutique. This week, I want to tell you about my GPS self-guided tours of Paris on the VoiceMap app. Derek wrote a review of my tours on the podcast Facebook group, and this is what he wrote. I want to put in a big plug for Annie's VoiceMap tours. They were the perfect way for my wife and I to explore neighborhoods. One afternoon, we did her Saint-Germain-des-Prés and the Latin Quarter tour, and the next we did Le Marais and Ile de la Cité. At only $9 a piece, they were worth their digital weight in gold. I wore one earbud and my wife wore the other. It knows exactly where you are due to GPS, so you can literally leave it in your pocket and have Annie telling you where to turn, what to see. It's the little things in the tour that make them great. We never would have seen the cannonball in the wall, the cute little spice shop, the tiny streets, the best wine shop ever, and so many other things without the tours. Thank you, Annie. Do more. Well, thank you for the kind words, Derek, and I've done 5 tours and I'll probably do more because I enjoy everything about them. And by the way, they only cost $8 if you buy them on my website, and you get an even bigger discount if you buy more than one. If you've taken my tours, please talk about them and review them on the app, because I work very hard to craft the best GPS self-guided tour possible, and I am very grateful to those of you who take them, review them, and share them. Merci beaucoup. After my chat with Elyse, I'll tell you a little bit about how French elections work, because our presidential election is coming up very fast. I'll also tell you about an important archaeological find this week underneath Notre Dame. The things you find when you start digging under a church. Bonjour, Elyse.
Bonjour, Annie.
We have a fun discussion today about a place that's, fun.
Kind of fun.
Some of it.
It's kind of fun. Actually, it's a place that really, really, really talks about the history of the kings and queens of France.
Yeah.
And it talks about something else, too, that's one of my most favorite things to talk about in the world, and that is stained glass windows.
Oh, very nice. Yes.
And so, fun? I guess so. Actually, I have a couple of gory things to tell as we get along in the story, so I'm not sure if that's going to be fun or not, but...
We'll see.
We'll see.
And we haven't said yet, but we're talking about Saint Denis, the Basilica.
And the Abbey.
And the Abbey of Saint Denis.
Right.
Just a little bit north of Paris.
It's actually, as they would say, limitrophe with Paris. It's really on the northern end. And according to what I was just reading, it's 5 kilometers, which is really nothing. It's 2 miles north of the limit of the city of Paris. So it's really a part of Paris almost, except that it has its own separate mayor.
Right.
It's actually a city.
So a very quick aside, Saint Denis is the poorest department in France.
Yeah.
The Basilica is not in a great neighborhood. If you go, I recommend you either take a taxi or an Uber. Voila.
Right.
Problem solved.
Problem solved. The thing is, the department is Saint-Denis.
C'est la
Saint-Denis.
C'est la Seine.
Saint-Denis, right. And this is the town of Saint Denis, which is a very big immigrant population at this point. And unfortunately, compared to what it was for centuries and centuries, is now very, very poor. So I honestly don't know if it's dangerous, but it's disorienting to get out in certain parts of it because you don't know where you are. It's very strange.
If you're from New York or a big city like that, you'll be fine taking the train. But if you're not, if you're a small town person, just take an Uber or a taxi.
Exactly. And it is a fact that there are, I don't know if we could say millions, but certainly hundreds of thousands of people who are interested in the history of France do go to visit the Abbey and the Basilica.
Because it is extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And maybe just to explain, because I even went back online to make sure that I knew what the difference was. What is a basilica as compared to a cathedral? Well, because we have a basilica here in Toulouse, which is the beautiful church of Saint-Sernin, but we also have a cathedral. And the cathedral in a district is the head church. That's usually where there's a bishop or an archbishop. So it's in a hierarchy, like in a corporation. That's where the top people are. But a basilica is a church that is an honored church because it's usually devoted to some saint that makes it a very important church in the history of the religion. And so that is why certain churches are called basilicas. It's actually an honorary title. It's not a parish church. It's not a cathedral. In some cases, it's actually more important than the cathedral. And the thing about Saint Denis is that it's not only a basilica, which is a title it's had for a long time, but it is genuinely one of the oldest churches ever established in France.
Mm-hmm.
It goes really, really, really far back.
Right. I think maybe it's got started at the same time as Notre Dame or soon after?
Much earlier.
Much earlier.
Much earlier.
Oh.
The actual building that we see now has had so many reincarnations, and I'll talk a little bit later about the last one, which came actually in the 19th century. But when I say this is the oldest church, let's start at the beginning. You were going to say that thing you were going to say.
Yeah, it's funny because when you say Saint Denis, the thing that pops in my head immediately is this funny bit in the movie Les Visiteurs where they just yell, Montjoire Saint Denis, que je trépasse si je faiblis, and then they start hitting each other with their swords. And I don't know what it means, but it's funny, you know?
Well, that's what's so interesting is that it is funny. And if anybody has not seen The Visitors, it's actually very funny. It really is, especially the first one. But the history of Saint Denis, Saint Denis, he was somebody who was alive in the 200s, in the 3rd century, when the region that we're talking about it was still part of the Roman Empire, actually. And he was sent, or he went, whether he was sent or he went, I don't know, with 2 colleagues to Christianize the area. So he came, they think he came from Rome, but who knows, actually. But he arrived in what was then Roman Paris, which was called Lutece, and he obviously annoyed the people who were ruling the city because he was martyred.
Right.
And this was I can make jokes about it, but of course this was not very fun for the people who were martyred. But it was in this time, in the 3rd century and 4th century AD, before this world around here got Christianized, that there were times when it was okay to be a Christian and times when it was not. But if you were a proselytizer, it was not necessarily a good thing.
Right.
You really, and you risked your head, and that's what happened to him. So, number 1, the myth of Saint Denis. He was decapitated, which unfortunately was the case of a lot of these early saints, at the place where we now have the church in Montmartre.
Right.
Which is why it was called the Hill of the Martyrs at the time, right?
Right.
Under the Romans. Now, this is a fact. More than that, I don't know as factual information. However, I will tell you what you can read about as a myth. And he wasn't the only one, but in this moment, this is the particular story of Saint Denis. He took his head, put it under his arm, and walked north.
Of course, as you do.
As you do. And within 2 days or maybe 3, he wound up on the other side of what is Montmartre, which is, of course, the northern end of Paris anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where he finally, I guess, just collapsed and was buried.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
You can only do so much with your head.
Under your arm. You can only go so far,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It is a fact that he is buried in the place where there is now the church and the abbey of Saint Denis.
Right.
And that is how it got its name. And he became the first Christian martyr of Paris. And that is why all of this is dedicated to him. So in The Visitors, when they cry that out, it's because under the medieval times, even earlier, Charlemagne and all of the earliest of the medieval kings, Saint Denis was one of their crying calls when they went into battle.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because Saint Denis was destined to protect the knights and the kings.
I see. So they're kind of calling on him to protect them or give him strength or something.
Yes, exactly. Right. And so that is why they're not calling on somebody else, right? It is a fact that there was a settlement there that was actually under the Romans. It was called Cataculus. It was extremely important there was a road that went up to the northern parts of Europe. And so it was extremely wealthy under the Romans because it was a trading route right there, basically. And what happened was that at the end of the 3rd century, when this person was actually buried there with his 2 colleagues, with his acolytes, there was a small Christian community there. And what happened was that within 100 years, the Roman Empire basically had disappeared. And the very first of the Frankish kings, and I don't want to go into too much weird detail, but it's really important to understand that that's why France is called France. It was these Frankish kings who had taken over this part. It was basically what is northern France and Belgium and a little bit further, the northwestern part of Germany. They were rulers there. They became the rulers. And among the first ones was a man named Clovis.
Right.
Who I think everyone in France learns about in school anyway. And he converted to Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was that early on, under Clovis, that the first small church was built, which means at the end of the 300s.
Yeah, that's a long time.
That's a long time ago. And then what happened was that you get his descendants, which includes a fair number of people, until we get to a man named Dagobert. I don't know why that name. Every time I wrote it on the paper, I thought, I really can't laugh when I say this name. It's like Dagobert. But hey, they had weird names back then.
Do you know the song?
No.
Le bon roi Dagobert a mis sa culotte en l'envers. Le grand Saint-Éloi lui dit: "Oh mon roi, votre majesté est mal culottée. C'est vrai, lui dit le roi, je vais la remettre à l'endroit."
Oh, I love it. You're going to have to translate it. I'm not going to take the time.
So the good King Dagobert put his pants on backwards, and somebody tells him, the Grand Saint-Éloi, so a saint tells him that he is not well outfitted, and the king says, "Oh, thank you, I will put it back on correctly." It's just a silly kid song.
It's very silly. It's really very, very silly. But there you go. Anyway, but Dagobert was someone who was one of the first people to enlarge the very small church that had been there, and he created the very first abbey, which means that he made it into a monastery.
Right.
It was a Benedictine monastery. And he did that so that he could be buried there.
Uh-huh.
And that was in the middle of the 600s.
Okay.
And this is all the first dynasty. And I'm going to use the word several times. I'm not even going to mention the name of the dynasty, but just to understand that he's one in the smack dab in the middle of what is one of the first important dynasty of kings that ruled France, which eventually became a much bigger country. And so what happened was that they decided that Saint Denis was going to be what they called an ad sanctos. I love this. This is Latin, okay? Ad sanctus, which meant that the kings and all of the members of the royal family would be buried there because it was next to the saint, and the saint is Saint Denis.
Okay.
And so this is a doctrine. There's actually a doctrine that was installed by the bishop or whatever, But he made this official so that from then on, this would be the resting place of the kings.
Right, because proximity to a saint made it more likely that you would be saved in the hereafter. The sanctity of the saint rubbed off on you or something.
Yes, and I think it's also, I would guess, it was considered to be an honor.
Sure.
If you go to any major cloistered monastery that still exists in France, you very often see the slabs in the floor where there have been people that have been buried there. But so this was the idea. So starting in the 600s, it became extremely important, and therefore the Church of Saint Denis was considered to be very, very sacred because it had the kings buried there as well, and their queens, and their ladies. And the royal sons were educated by the monks, the Benedictine monks, in this particular monastery, which, of course, when you think about it, even in 1400 years ago, 3 or 4 miles is not that far. You know, if you're thinking about if they lived in Paris in the city in the city center, I mean, you didn't have to go too far to get there, but they lived there, obviously. And this continued. This is so it was the 500s, the 600s, the 700s, the 800s, which goes through the entire dynasty, this particular dynasty, until you get to the 800s, when the entire church and the monastery, like almost everything else, is sacked by the Vikings. And the Vikings came through on the Seine River and basically pillaged everywhere. Some of the original church was saved, but not that much of it. But it was after the Vikings finally left for good. Why they stopped after a certain point, I have no idea. But they reinforced the walls around it, and they moved on to the next dynasty, which is the dynasty basically of Charlemagne and his children.
Okay.
And they reinforced everything, and it was still very, very prestigious. And we still have all the kings and the queens pretty much being buried there.
Mm-hmm.
And this takes us into the heart of the Middle Ages.
Okay.
When you get to the year 1000, it's another world altogether, and there's a lot more prosperity, and France is not totally unified, but a good chunk of it has now been unified. And there's the feudal system in place. And you have many, many, many monasteries and many churches everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the beginning of churches that are no longer just these, squat things that we now call, the old Romanesque style, which is the rounded arches and kind of squattish-looking buildings. And various places in the north, particularly in Ile-de-France and the region around Paris, where they're experimenting and trying to make things a little bit lighter and a little bit higher. And there was this abbot. His name was Abbé Suger. It's written like sugar, Suger, but it in fact is pronounced Suger. And
some people say Suger.
I know.
Yeah.
I just had this conversation with my husband, but my professor at the university said Suger, so
right.
I'll go with him. It doesn't matter, really.
Yeah.
His name was Suger. He apparently was criticized by many of the other theologians and some of the bishops because he had what would be considered to be a rather extra idea of what should be done with the church. But he was a very brilliant, very well-educated man. And he obviously had some notions also of construction. Because what happened was, he looked around at some of the churches that were being built in Normandy, of all places. This is where pretty much his ideas began, by traveling to some of the churches and the monasteries in Normandy. And he went back to Saint Denis. He said, it's now time to get rid of this church that dates from the 600s, 700s, whatever. Renovation time. Let's start all over again. We're going to make a new church. And this time we're going to make a church that has a new concept. And the concept had to do with what has come to be known as Gothic architecture.
Right.
Because what he did was, and the reason he did it is why I find it so fascinating, he said, I want builders to be able to make taller walls so that they can put in more and more and more window, that is more and more glass, because I want to have tall stained glass, which was something extraordinarily expensive. Having colored glass was something that was like gold. It was that difficult to make, and it was extremely expensive to make, because he wrote a thesis where he talked about how light and color brings you to a sense of eternity and to heaven. And that for people to go into a church, he wanted them to be literally, in a sense, blown away by how beautiful it was, by the color and by the light coming through the color, and that would give them an idea of what heaven was like if they were a good Christian.
Right. The reflection of the light against the walls. And it is true that at Saint Denis, you see some beautiful colors.
You see some beautiful colors.
Yeah.
So it took a long time. It took about 35 years. He actually lived a fairly long time himself. So he had the money, he had the means to do it. They basically rebuilt and enlarged the church, and they added what we now call a deambulatory, which means when you go to a big church, and most people who've visited a church in France, and I would guess even in England and perhaps in Germany, you know that there's a part where you have chapels behind the altar and you can go from one to the other and it kind of circles around in a U shape. That's called the deambulatory. That's where these chapels all are. And he had the builders make the walls as high as they could. It's not the highest, of course. You know, there were other churches and cathedrals, including Notre Dame, that came afterwards that were inspired by this. But what he did was he made the very first full Gothic church with Gothic windows. And there is one window that actually shows him kneeling down, because in those days, that's what they did. They would show the donator or the inspiration for a particular window at the very bottom of the windows. And so by the end of the 1100s, the new Saint Denis existed. And it was the very first full Gothic church with beautiful, tall, stained glass windows that were in all of these chapels. There were a total at the time of 14 double windows all the way around.
Right. So it's about the same time as Notre Dame, because Notre Dame was 1182.
Exactly. Notre Dame was started at the moment when this was finished.
Okay.
Literally, they took the ideas and they simply went a couple of miles further. And it was also, obviously, the same time when they started a bunch of the other places, too. There was Laon, and then there's, I'm not sure if Reims was a little bit later, but there were 2 or 3 of the other places that they started just about at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really considered that Saint Denis is the very, very first. So here we now have the basilica and the monastery, which has been enlarged enormously, partly because of this abbot who wants to make this gorgeous Gothic church. And also, it was enlarged to make more room to bury more of the kings and queens. And they had to have more floor space to put all of these stone sculptures in, because what you have there, of course, is what are called gisants. And a gisant is basically a flat, it's a relief sculpture above ground tomb, which usually, you know, you've seen them. Sometimes it's knights with their arms crossed, you know, and with their armor. They're usually very beautifully carved and everything. But that, each one for a specific king or queen, and sometimes princes and people like that.
Yeah, they have a whole bunch of them.
They have a whole bunch of them. So they had to include much more floor space in order to have room for them, because they were running out.
Right. And they also have these kind of mini chapels inside of the church with famous people buried inside, as well as a crypt down below.
Yes, and the crypt down below has the relics of Saint Denis.
Okay.
That's, I mean, to whatever extent you can carve and date and at least know that it's a certain time period, that is considered to be actually the relics of Saint Denis.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the reasons why it stayed such a holy place is because the relics of Saint Denis have been there ever since the 200s, basically. Assuming, if you can say that the body is really from the 200s, probably is him. Who knows?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So this is the beginning of the glorious, glorious times for Saint Denis. It becomes famous for the beauty of the church, and it becomes famous for being the holy site of the funeral site, basically, of all the kings of France. What happened, strangely enough, is that the century afterwards, which I hadn't known, was that they decided to redo it after all the work that he did, so that in the late 1200s, they enlarged it again, they added more windows, more of these gorgeous stained glass windows. They added more space for the burial of the kings. And that church is basically the church that existed up to the time of the French Revolution. And it, of course, became the King's Church.
Right.
I mean, this is, so we've talked about it. I know you've had even other people come on and talk in length about the French Revolution and how it was such an incredibly important and upheaving kind of event in France. Well, I was doing a lot of reading about this, partly because I am very interested in the history of stained glass windows, and partly because when you start reading, you just keep on reading and so on, right? You get to Louis XIV, and Louis XIV, now this is this is, of course, 100 years before the Revolution. He decides that the monastery of Saint Denis is a bit too rich. This was something that had happened in many of the Benedictine monasteries all over France. They were basically having a rich life that was not very monastic. And so he downgraded them a little bit. That was his way of punishing them. And he said that a lot of the revenue that was going to them was going to be given somewhere to another abbey, to another monastery, because, I mean, I'm using my own words, but it was like, you can't do this anymore, This is like fiscal evasion, never mind, okay? So basically, by the time we get to the French Revolution, even though all the kings, including Louis XIV, are buried there, it is not as important in the minds of people as it had been for all these centuries and centuries and centuries. But it is forever and ever associated with the dynasties that have ruled France. So you have 4 major dynasties, and the last one is the dynasty of the Bourbons, and those are the Louis, the last dynasties before we get to the French Revolution. And this is what happens. Now I'm going to take another piece of paper because I wrote this down with red because it so impressed me that I thought I have to give you this information. The French Revolution was very anti-ecclesiastic, and it was very anti-monarchy.
Right.
And they decided, the people who really ran the revolution, specifically when it got to be the part that was very violent. So we are in the year 1792. They decided that the one church and the one monastery that represented everything that was bad in the history of France in relation to the monarchy was Saint Denis, which had been known and visited by millions of people over the hundreds of years that it existed because of all of these tombs, these sculptures, and the gorgeous stained glass windows. And so the revolution went to Saint Denis, and they basically destroyed it. And this is what they did. They didn't simply tear down the monastic buildings, which is what they did in many, many parts of France, really. Usually they left the churches, but they destroyed the monastic buildings. At Saint Denis, they tore down most of the monastic buildings. They took the roof off of the basilica. They destroyed most of the stained glass windows. Why? To take the lead that was used to hold the small pieces of gorgeous colored glass together to melt down to make bullets. They took the tombs of the kings going as far back as Clovis, and they destroyed the tombs, and they took the bodies out. And they took the bodies of all of these kings and queens. This is how many they took. They destroyed the tombs of 42 kings, 32 queens, 63 princes, 30 abbots, the heads of the monastery, and various other royal people who were also buried there.
Wow.
They took all of the bodies, they put them into an enormous, what is called in France, a fosse commun, an enormous open trench. They covered it with live lime to disintegrate the bodies, covered it up, and basically left Saint Denis in total ruin.
Wow.
Total ruin. I made a list. I color-coded it to show which of the kings that we think about, that we know when we talk about France a lot, were destroyed. And it's most of the ones that we talk about. And when we're talking about things, I mean, it's absolutely amazing. They took out Clovis, who was one of course, the first, the founder of the first dynasty. But they took out all of the Louis. They took out Henry IV. They took out Francois I. They took out a whole bunch of these kings and their queens, and they destroyed their bodies. In 1803, Napoleon was he had basically gone from being a revolutionary to taking over everything.
Yeah. I guess you can put it that way, yeah.
I mean, basically, it was like he decided he knew best and he was going to start running things.
Yeah.
And he decided that he was going to reinstate the glory of Saint Denis. But first of all, it had to be rebuilt, which took an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of time. But what he did do, after the fighting actually stopped and when he finally really took power, he decided to consecrate the building itself. He set up a huge amount of money to start rebuilding a good part of it. But he also decided, because he was Napoleon, that not only was he going to reinstate something in honor of the 4 dynasties of kings that had ruled France, but he was going to make a 5th section for the emperors that were going to come after him.
Oh.
Yes. So that there was not just the 4 dynasties, there were the 4 dynasties, and then there was the dynasty of the emperors.
Plus the emperors,
Plus
yes.
the emperors,
Sure.
right? Unfortunately for him, it didn't work out quite that way.
No.
But it is a fact that they started to rebuild, so that the last king to be buried there was actually Charles XVIII in 1824, after the Revolution,
Right.
after Napoleon, and in the midst of the renovation. Now, the rebuilding of Saint Denis took all of the 19th century. And sadly, even though most people would not know it, most of the windows, except for 5, are not the original windows.
They don't look old enough to me. I mean, I didn't know this, but they do look like they're more modern than...
Well, what apparently, and I was there once, but I was there with my husband and my deceased mother-in-law, and she was really very, very interested as a French woman who was a historian in the dynasties of France. And so, to be honest, even though I love stained glass windows, I didn't really pay much attention to them. We were looking at all these tombs of all these people whom I didn't know anything about, basically,
Right.
It's like, walking around, because what they did was, starting at the beginning of the 19th century, and it's very macabre to me, but boom, whatever. They went to this enormous pit where all of these bones were, and they dug out a bunch of them. Now, of course, they would be different. This is 200 years later. They could actually do DNA testing now and discover probably some of the, who was who. But what they did was they took a bunch of them out, because I guess they figured they were all royals anyway, one way or the other.
Yeah.
And they made a space for them back inside the church. That is where they put the bones back in.
Okay, so they retrieved some of them.
So they retrieved some of them. And by retrieving them, what they did was they made a list, not of the bones, because they don't really know whose bones they have, but of all of the kings and queens who would have been in their tombs, but who had been taken out during the French Revolution. So they recognized the fact that this had happened, and they bring them back in, and now there's a kind of a commemorative thing for them. But what was fascinating to read about was that there are 5 windows that are still the originals, which is really more from somewhere between the 1100s and 1200s. Most of the other windows, and they say very clearly, the windows that are the darkest are obviously the oldest, but they're in very bad shape. And one of the things I thought was very interesting to read about was that the people who are interested in preserving Saint Denis and in giving it back its allure, because it's certainly important in the history of France, they are up against a certain amount of resistance. It was nominated to be a World UNESCO Heritage Building, just the way Saint-Sernin is here.
Mm-hmm.
But it was refused because of the state it's in, even now. And apparently the federal government and the culture, the Ministry of Culture, is not giving it a lot of money to keep up the building and to go back. They rebuilt the roof. They rebuilt most of the walls almost in identical fashion, but they haven't been able to give it the luster, I guess, that it had before this time. Mm-hmm. So when you go again, what you see are reproductions that were, they say it's interesting because 19th century stained glass windows, usually you can see that they are indeed 19th century windows, even when they're very, very well done. They said that they found the best glassmakers they could find in the beginning of the 1800s. But of course, it does not reproduce exactly what was made before. The thing is that when the windows were destroyed, a lot of the pieces were recuperated by museums and people who came and took them. So believe it or not, there are pieces of the glass from Saint Denis in churches in England. There are pieces in churches in the United States. There are pieces in the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, which has a huge medieval collection of art and armor and things like that. And so they can't even bring it all back together. There are a couple in the Cluny that we've seen together, that are actually from there. There are some in the Museum of Archaeology that is in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. But they've scattered so much that there's not enough for them to actually bring together and make a genuine window that's really fully from the 1100s, which is a shame, right. Which is really a shame. So the glory of this place, which was the very first magnificent Gothic church with these gorgeous windows, and which really represented the four major dynasties of rulers in France, was crumbled, basically by the French Revolution. And the work it took in the entire 19th century, and a lot of work by Violet le Duc, to try and bring it back to something that resembled what it was before. And the one place that is really like it was before is the western portals with the 3 doors, because they had enough drawings and information that they could redo it so that it was exactly the way it had been before, very much like they did some of the work on Notre Dame. But some of the other pieces are a little bit different from what they were before.
Right.
Yeah. But it's really a fascinating place to go if you want to get an idea of how important these dynasties and how important the kings and queens of France actually were. And one last bit, because this all made me so happy and excited to read about. I can't tell you why. It's really, in the 1960s, they've been doing a lot of archaeological digging, and now we have lasers. I don't know if they had them in the 60s, whatever. But some archaeologist was working in a piece of Saint Denis where they discovered that underground there was actually a corridor that led to the oldest part from the 500s, which apparently was really buried so far down that they didn't even know it existed. So they were doing this digging, and what happened was they came upon a tomb, and they opened it up, and inside this tomb, they discovered a full skeleton of a woman, preserved well enough that they knew immediately that it was a woman. She had long blonde hair. She was clothed. The clothing had actually not completely disintegrated. And she had all of her jewelry, which was given, I guess she was, buried with her jewelry, and included rings and a thing that had her name on it. And it turns out that her name was Arégonde, and she was the third wife of Clotaire I, who was one of the earliest Frankish kings under the Merovingians. She lived from 516 to 575. This is documented. And they were able to do all kinds of testing on her to find out how old she was when she died, what diseases she had. And everything was completely preserved inside the tomb, so that she is considered to be the oldest fully equipped tomb from the earliest part of the Middle Ages found in Western Europe.
Wow.
And her remains are in some vault in the Archaeology Museum, and her jewelry is on display in the Archaeology Museum in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. And I went online to look at it because it's absolutely gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And what I didn't know was that in this earliest dynasty, the Merovingians, which lasted 300 years, actually, from the beginning of the 500s to the very end of the 700s, the kings were allowed to have as many wives as they wanted.
Oh, I see.
So she was wife number 3, but she was lucky because it was her son that became king.
Ah.
Yeah, I mean, there was probably some nice infighting between the wives.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
And it's interesting, too, because it said that according to the church, of course, there was no such thing as polygamy, but the kings, who were from basically Germanic ancestry, decided that that did not apply to them.
Sure.
So Madame Arégonde, or Queen Arégonde, is the oldest known queen to have been buried in Saint Denis.
Very nice. Well, I thought the church looked good. Like, it looked a bit cold. The color of the stone is a kind of a darkish, well, not dark, but it's a gray. It's definitely a gray. And so it gives this impression of being severe. It's not a church when you walk in that you're like, oh, warm and fuzzy, not a bit. But if it's sunny outside and you see the sunbeams going through the windows and hitting the walls, is just gorgeous. It's really a beautiful church. And my impression was that there were a lot of people buried there. I'm sure I heard about the Revolution because I took a tour. They offer tours that, and I recommend you do that. Like, you show up and you look at the ticket office. You have to pay a little bit to go into the crypt, or maybe I don't remember if you have to or not. I paid anyway to get a tour. Right. And the tour guide was going to start half an hour later, so it was perfect for me. And they do tours every day, pretty much. Now, with COVID, who knows if they've resumed the tours or not. A lot of places haven't, so we'll have to see if that comes back or not. But I thought it was really interesting to take a tour, because then the tour guide could show us things, which obviously I promptly forgot because they tell you so many things.
It's hard to remember it all.
Yeah. A tour guide is like a wealth of information, but it's good because now if you listen to the podcast, you can, you have Elyse's recap, and it'll help you, get ready.
Right. And if I understand correctly, because I do remember seeing a bunch of the tombs, but the part that they spent the most time bringing back to life is the last dynasty, the Bourbon. So there is a huge gallery with the tombs that have been basically preserved or redone that are the Bourbon. So basically the last full dynasty, starting really with Henry IV. And of course the oldest ones are probably the ones that would have been the hardest to bring back to life, in the sense that they would have had more work to do on them. And I think since most people remember more, things about Louis XIV and people like that, it means more to most people visiting than it would be for the ones that were, 1,000 years ago and things like that.
So Louis XV was also buried there, and they also desecrated his grave.
Yes, in fact, of the ones that from that time period, the ones, so they did away with Clovis, which of course is like saying, hey, you started this whole thing, we're going to get rid of you. That's they did Hugues Capet, who was the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, right? Then they did a few of the Valois. And now, for most people out there, it wouldn't make any difference. They don't have any idea who really the Valois were. But the one of the last ones was, of course, Francois I. Interestingly enough, I made a mistake when I said he was destroyed there. He was not. He was not destroyed, and I don't know why. But they did. They started with Henry IV, his 2 wives, Margaret of France, Maria de Medici, clap, clap, Louis XIII, his wife, Anne of Austria, Louis XIV, his wife, Marie Therese of Austria, Louis XV, his wife, who was from Poland. And that was when it stopped. They did not do Louis XVI, strangely enough. Why? I have no idea. Maybe at the time his tomb was not there, because it is now. And of course, they didn't do the ones that came afterwards because they were brought in after the revolution actually stopped all of that. So basically, most of the Bourbons were destroyed.
Wow. Just crazy story. We can't explain why the revolutionaries did this. I mean, we know that the church had really pushed the limits for centuries and people were getting fed up. But why did they have to, well, first of all, kill the king? Because, a constitutional monarchy would have done just fine. The way it is in England would have been just as good, I think. And also, why did they have to do that in Saint Denis? What's the point of being vindictive like that? And maybe it was a form of terrorism, like we'll scare you into submission?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I was reading it. It got me upset. And I said something to my husband, and he looked at me as if to say, why would you care one way or the other? And I thought, because you can't take away history that existed, And so it's one thing to understand why there was a revolution, why they wanted to change things. And it is true that certainly, the last couple of 100 years, there was an enormous amount of abuse on the part of the monarchy in terms of the wealth that they had, that they accrued, and the way people were really dying of starvation, and they were making wars everywhere. So you can understand that. But why go and take out the bones of bodies, it's very strange to me.
I would be upset if they did that to the family cemetery in my village.
Right.
It's not because they're kings. You just don't do that.
Well, it's a kind of fury that it's, I'm sure psychologists would have a way of describing it, but it doesn't undo the past, So it's like, if it's one thing to say from now on, this is not what we don't want it anymore. This has got to stop. But it's like a child having a tantrum, only it's far worse, because it's really, there's something obscene about it to me, really, you know. It's very gruesome. It's kind of obscene, and it's also totally irrational. On some level, I think it's totally irrational. So it doesn't make a difference. And of course, there was a part of the Revolutionary Committee that did want to save the king, and they didn't like him necessarily, but they didn't want to kill him.
Right.
The regicide was not part of their program,
Right.
And so, of course, in the end, what happened was they also lost their heads, So, but then the result of that is that you get Napoleon afterwards, who thinks, oh, whoopee, we're going to start for the fifth dynasty. Here we go.
Yeah.
And that never happened either,
Mm-hmm.
Let's face it, especially if you come from a new country like the United States or Australia, a country or Canada. All of this is fascinating, and it's a history that goes so far back. It's hard to even absorb completely.
Yeah.
But I think Saint Denis is fascinating.
It's a beautiful place. It's well worth a visit, especially for people who've been to Paris several times. I think it's really a very sobering kind of, well, not sobering, but it's just an interesting place that has quite a bit of beauty to it, with the caveat that it's in the middle of a not great neighborhood. Not that it's necessarily a dangerous neighborhood,
but it's funky.
But you're gonna see things that you're not used to. So
it's the poor part of life, and it's not what tourists see usually.
Right.
That's basically it. Just talking about the stained glass and how beautiful it is. Louis IX, Saint Louis, who of course is the one who created the Sainte-Chapelle.
Yeah.
He of course is buried there as well. So
was he also pulled out and all that?
No, apparently not.
Oh, okay.
I'll figure why. Maybe there was some they could have easy access to.
Yeah, who knows?
Who knows? But anyway, it's beautiful. And just think, if you go there, it's the very first. It's this abbot who decided that colored glass was going to inspire people, and thank goodness for that. We have all these absolutely gorgeous stained glass windows in Gothic churches.
Thank you so much, Elyse. That was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
You're welcome.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting the show and giving back. Patrons get several exclusive rewards for doing so. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. Thank you all for supporting the show. Some of you have been doing it for a long time. You are wonderful. And a shout out this week to new patrons, Laurie Billing, Wendy Weasel Bothworth, Lester Chu, and Tina Lang. Thank you so much for becoming patrons and making this podcast possible. Thank you, Lois Binesh, for upgrading your support to yearly, and to Teresa Brandeburg for doing another one-time donation by using the green button on Join Us in France that says Tip Your Guide. I see you and I appreciate all of you who keep me producing this podcast. Another way to support this podcast is to hire me to be your itinerary consultant. Here's how it works. You purchase the service on joinusinfrance.com/boutique. Then you tell me what you have in mind. I do my research. I write up what I think is best for you. And then, and I think that's the part people enjoy the most, I talk about it with you on the phone for a whole hour if you need it. And you get to ask me all your questions. And really, once you've done that, you are ready for the best time in France. This week in French news, French people are continuing to do whatever they can to help the people of Ukraine. This week, I heard a very touching interview with a young man from Bordeaux who just felt like there must be so many women and children escaping this war that there was a need for baby products. So he loaded up his beat-up car, he said. He too has a ghetto car. With all the baby products that he could find, both purchased and donated, and he drove them to the Ukrainian border. He thought he'd just unload and head home, but he's been there for a couple of weeks now, organizing more baby product deliveries. And he says the need is great and that there are no major NGOs in the area where he is. So it is definitely helping lots of people. A woman who normally runs a gîte near Marseille was interviewed. She is now hosting a couple of Ukrainian retirees who arrived to Marseille with their 4 grandchildren. The parents stayed behind in Ukraine to fight. She prepared her gîte, filled up the fridge with food, and tried to communicate with them, but it didn't go so easily because they don't have any language in common. But she said they seemed really happy to have a safe place to stay with the kids and that they have been sleeping a lot. 20,000 Ukrainian refugees have arrived in France already, with the goal of taking in at least 100,000 as soon as possible. They are mostly families with children. I heard one elementary school teacher saying that the little Ukrainian boy in her class is doing really well. He didn't understand any French at all when he first arrived, but these are kids who already know Ukrainian and Russian. Many of them also know some English. They will be conversational in French within 3 months and totally fluent within 6 months. Now, if we could just keep their parents safe and make it possible for them to go home, I think that's what most of them want to do, and I understand that. A handful of people have asked me if this situation makes it more dangerous to visit France, and it doesn't. Ukraine is far from France physically, even if we are very close to them in spirit. There's been an archaeological find underneath Notre Dame. We're back to the crypt. The Institut National de Recherche Archéologique Préventive, that's INRAP. Yes, it's a thing. We have emergency archaeologists in France. They've been working inside of Notre Dame since early February because they had a sneaking suspicion there might be some interesting stuff under the cathedral floor. They were right. They found a lead sarcophagus that nobody was expecting to find. They already know it's from the 1300s, which means not long after the cathedral was built. They snuck an endoscopy camera inside, and they can see cloth and hair. The remains seem very well preserved, so who knows who's under there? Can't wait to find out. They also found the remains of the Jubé. A Jubé is a rood screen. It's something that used to be common in cathedrals, but they were taken down, most of them, with changes in the liturgy. One spectacular Jubé that's left in Paris is the one at Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. So back to the archaeologists, the INRAP team has until March 25th to complete their work. Those who watch too many movies are going to say, oh no, they're going to open an old sarcophagus buried underneath a cathedral since the 1300s. Could possibly go wrong. But I say hooray for the INRAP. They are ready for any curses the dead might throw at them for disrupting their peace. The French election is coming up, and I want to explain how it works here briefly. In France, we vote for one thing at a time. So the only decision we'll have to make this time is going to be about the president. We'll go back when it's time to vote for mayor, and back again when it's time to vote for representatives. This is good because it keeps things simple, but it also means that we have to go back to the polls more often. Despite that, France usually gets pretty good turnout, although it's been eroding the last couple of elections, so let's hope people turn out and vote. We vote in 2 rounds, unless one of the candidates gets more than 50% of the votes in the first round. That's never happened under the current constitution, which is the 5th constitution. Whenever we make a change to the constitution, we have to start over again with a new one. So we've amended our constitution 5 times, which is why we're on the 5th constitution. So because we have 12 candidates who are running, it's extremely unlikely that anyone would win in just first round. It's not going to happen. The French voting system could not be simpler. You register in the place you live, and you don't have to do that until you move, which for most French people is not very often. You go to the poll in your area with your ID. When you enter, you pick up an envelope and a piece of paper with the name of each candidate, or at least you pick up a few of them so it's not obvious who you're going to vote for. And you go behind a privacy curtain, you put the name of the person you want in the envelope, you go to the table where the officials are sitting, you show your ID, they find your name in the big book, and they get you to sign the register indicating that you voted, and they invite you to put your envelope in a big plexiglass box that everybody can see that you're just putting one in there. And then you shake the mayor's hand or give him a fist bump these days, and off you go. That's it. In my village, it takes 2 minutes. Literally, it's a 2-minute affair. But even when I voted in downtown Toulouse, which was a lot more crowded than my village, it never took more than 5 minutes. Then later in the day, volunteers show up to count the votes by hand. They make stacks of the different names of paper that people chose. And by 8 p.m., the percentages are announced officially on TV. There are no voting machines. Requests for recounts are possible, but they don't happen that often. The results are known on the day you vote. It's very straightforward. Political parties are not involved in the voting per se in France, which is the way it should be, in my opinion. It's city staff and volunteers who do it. And of course, some of these people have opinion, about politics, but it's not like the political party sends, here's my guy, I'm sending you my guy, and he's going to fight for the right of my candidate to win. No, we don't do that, okay? French people normally like to complicate everything, but when it comes to elections, we've kept it simple, and I think that's a very good thing. Show notes for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/381, the numeral. And that's also where you'll see Elyse's notes about our conversation today. Sometimes she gets to talk about all the things she had written down. Sometimes she doesn't, so it's good to have her notes. And also a full transcript of the conversation. I would really appreciate if you enjoy the show that you tell someone about it, share it on social media. If you know somebody who's going to France, remember you can tag them. Go to the Join Us in France page, share the post, and tag them in it so that they will see it. And I bet they will be very grateful because people want to have better information about their next trip to France. Next week on the podcast, an episode with Ryan Gemutza, where we talk about whether to go or not to go. How do you make that decision? When are you ready to travel again? So that'll be next week on the podcast. Questions or feedback to Annie@joinusinfrance.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France Travel Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2022 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.